Imagine reading curated opinion pieces that aim to help us better understand policy and politics from the people closest to it, or sometimes people who want to be far from it. We offer political insights without the limit of column inches. Introducing Quotes by Air Quotes Media, creators of the Herle Burly and Curse of Politics podcasts, where we bring politics from the inside out. And now with Quotes, you can read from contributors like Jim Coyle, Jim Stanford, and Kathleen Wynne, with more to come. Read Quotes at airquotesmedia.com/quotes.
All right, you ever-curious Herle Burlyites. This is a notable pod, a distinguished pod, a record-setting pod. Because today on the show, we have a guest who's making his fourth appearance. Save for regular panel guests, that's unprecedented. And he shoots the lights out every time. Today, Peter Weltman takes his place atop the upper echelon of Herle Burly contributors. For that, we'll probably give him a nice crisp t-shirt. Regular listeners will remember that Mr. Weltman is the Independent Financial Accountability Officer of Ontario. That means he heads an office that provides independent fiscal, financial, and economic analysis on the state of the province's finances, plus trends in the provincial economy. He's just released a couple of reports that are quite relevant with a provincial budget coming up imminently. One is on the overall spending and fiscal projections for the Government of Ontario. The other is on healthcare and healthcare spending. There was a big headline out of the healthcare spending one that said that Ontario is going to be short just a tad over $21 billion in healthcare funding by 2027. So we'll be unlikely to achieve the Ford government's stated commitments of adding enough beds and staff to keep up with demand. We're going to dive into all of that really deeply. Peter, welcome back to the Herle Burly. So glad you're here. Maybe we could rent you a cot or something.
That's great. Thanks very much for having me back. I was wearing my Chris t-shirt the other day. It's actually quite comfy. So
excellent. Thank you very much. Where are you at today?
I'm in Ottawa. I live in Ottawa and I work in Toronto and I go back and forth. And now that my daughter is back at school in Toronto, and I've kind of taken over the basement bedroom, and I've got my office set up here, and it's very cozy. So works. And
you were working remotely before COVID, weren't you?
Yes. We were not as much, but our office does. Our office has always had a work from home policy. I was in about 4 days a week into Toronto, but my staff is always, so consequently, we've had a lot of practice at how to work remotely. And then when the pandemic hit, it wasn't a huge transition.
Right. Peter, just for our listeners, can you give me a quick primer again on what your position is, who it reports to, and how it differs from the numbers that the government puts out?
Sure. So we are. I am an independent officer of the Legislative Assembly. So we have other officers of the Ledge. They're the Auditor General, the Chief Electoral Officer, the Ombudsman, the Ethics Commissioner, and the Information and Privacy Commissioner. And we are all appointed by on the recommendation of a steering committee panel with concurrence in the House. So there's a motion passed in the House to appoint us. So we are independent of the government. We effectively report to the legislature. So basically, I'm accountable to the legislature. And at any time, the legislature, the committee, or any MPP can kind of haul me up and ask me to answer to whatever it is. So in any event, that's one. There's an FAO Act that tells me what I'm allowed to do. I provide fiscal and economic forecasting and budget and spending implications and program costs to the Legislative Assembly. I'm given a mandate or a budget to do that with. And with that budget, I hire people and rent office space and get data and all that sort of thing. So budget's around just under $4 million a year. We have 20 full-time staff, and that's how we roll.
Awesome. Do you get questions that you answer from members of the legislature?
Yeah. So we can do work in a bunch of ways. One is questions from MPPs. We get a lot of those. Often those are incorporated into our regular work. So we have regular work that we do. We do 2 budget outlooks per year. We do 4 expenditure monitors per year. And often we're able to answer a lot of those questions within those reports. We can do work on our own volition. We take committee requests, and that's how the work comes in. And just to give you an example, we've effectively got next year almost fully booked. I mean, we've got room for a few MPP requests. We do that on purpose, but that's how it's been. We try to triage, and if something comes up that's more pertinent or more timely, or if it's a committee motion, that always goes to the top of the list. If it's an MPP request, we try to move that up the list as well.
Cool. Very interesting. Okay, let's get into it then.
Sure.
Let's start with the overall picture. As I read your overall financial pre-budget report, you're projecting something close to a recession for the coming year in Ontario.
That's right. Yeah.
What's going to cause that economic slowdown?
So what we're seeing is basically interest rates. I mean, interest rates going up. The intent of rising interest rates is to dampen demand, reduce demand. As money becomes more expensive, people have to make tougher choices in terms of where they spend that money, especially if your mortgage rate is going up. And Canada has generally relative to the States, Canada has a pretty high, the value of Canadian homes relative to their net worth is much, much higher than in the US. So consequently, there are a lot of folks who have, mortgages, big and small. And as those rates go up, that takes money out of disposable income that they might otherwise spend elsewhere. We've seen a rise in inflation, which has dampened demand as well, which has spurred on the interest rate hike. And that takes money out of people's pockets also. So that's so where we are still seeing a slowdown in economic activity. We don't think we're going to hit recession, but I mean, it's pretty close. But we will see we're projecting a significant slowdown for 2023.
Right. And was that based on the Bank of Canada staying at 4.5%? And what are the implications if they go further? Because there's both the Fed in the States and the language in Canada indicated that that's at least a possibility.
Yeah, so I think both in Canada and the States, the central banks are trying very hard to stamp out inflation before it ingrains itself into the economy. Once you have inflation expectations and people are expecting inflation to be there and they're expecting their wages to go up and they're expecting prices to go up, it gets pretty messy. We lived through that in the 70s. You and I probably did. Maybe we bought different chocolate bars, but we certainly remember the days when chocolate bars went from 5 cents to 10 cents to 25 cents.
Absolutely.
And it seemed like it happened overnight, right? And it was so the allowance that you got never usually, at least my allowance never usually kept up. So I had to start buying smaller chocolate bars at the corner store. But that's what the central banks are trying to
collecting
eliminate.
Bottles.
What's that?
Collecting bottles.
Oh, yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
Collecting bottles. Yeah. Yes, that was before the plastic. That's right. Collecting bottles and bringing them back to the store and getting your nickel or your 10 cents back. So I'm not nostalgic for those days, just so people understand that. That's let's just make that clear. So the bank's trying to stamp out inflation. Inflation in the States appears, the central bank, the Fed is still thinks they have work to do. In Canada, we've seen inflation start to come down. We've seen especially commodity prices have dropped down fairly rapidly. Energy's been up and down like a yo-yo, partly because of the war in the Ukraine. Food prices have been up. Overall energy, has been up a lot, but it's been bouncing a bit. The war in the Ukraine has put a lot of pressure on food prices, certainly in Europe, tiny little bit here, energy as well. So the Fed and the bank are still concerned there's still some inflation left. In Canada, though, the bank has to be a little more cautious because, as I mentioned before, because of the impact of the housing piece, right? So right now, we're not seeing, the mortgage default rate's still very low. We're not seeing people lose give up their homes just yet. We've seen a dramatic slowdown in the real estate.
Thanks to the OSFI stress test.
They're very, very likely. But also, too, there's propensity when you've got a choice between, paying your mortgage or going on a trip. Most people tend to pay their mortgage, right? They want to keep the house. That's usually the last thing you try to do. You try to hang on to as best you can. And as long as you're working, as long as there's employment, we're not likely going to see, a significant rash of defaults. It's if the economy really, really tanks and people start to lose their jobs, that may change the equation a little bit. We're not there. The other thing that may have an impact, obviously, if rates start to go up and it starts to force people to sell that they otherwise might not want to sell. And then you might see a little bit of activity in the housing market. And when you have so many people with so much of their wealth in housing, and if that starts to unravel a bit, then then that becomes a bit more of a problem for the bank. So the bank's trying to be a little bit cautious. The other thing too to keep in mind is when you raise rates as a bank, it can take a year before the impact of that kind of works its way through the economy. And I think the bank is, in my opinion anyway, and there's a million opinions out there. In my opinion, I think it's prudent to sort of, they've jacked it up a lot. Let's just see how it goes. And I think that's sort of the approach that they're taking. And the Fed is being a lot more hawkish, if you will. They're still not convinced they've stamped out inflation.
Right. And so you're optimistic in the report that inflation will return to a 2 to 3% level in the near future. Does that mean that interest rates will come back down, or do they stay where they are when that happens?
No, we will. Well, typically what happens is as inflation starts to come back, if economic activity cools, it takes inflation down with it. I mean, this is the theory, right? So, sometimes theory and practice don't always line up, but that's the theory. And if the bank sees that inflation is starting to cool and prices are starting to come back, then they may, start to see rates start to come back down again. But that could be a year out, right? It could be a year or more before rates start to come back down. But I think they're going to be watching carefully because there was a period in the 70s where, especially in the States, the central bank kind of went up and down, and they took the foot off the gas too soon, and then inflation crept back in. So I think they're trying to avoid doing that this time around. Some of those bankers still also bought chocolate bars right back in the 70s too. So.
Hey, a question about inflation. I keep hearing and reading that one of the drivers of inflation in Canada now are wages. That doesn't feel like it's true on the ground to me. That doesn't feel to me like it's how people are experiencing things. Where is the wage growth that's helping to drive inflation?
A lot of the wage growth right now is in, so it's a great question because some of the wage growth is in sort of the professional kind of, that sector. So there's definitely some good wage growth in the, not so much in finance right now. There was professional services, IT, although IT is starting to come back a little bit. There's a fair bit of wage growth in the service sector, right? Restaurants, hotels, there's been significant wage growth there.
You mean like wait staff?
That's right, like wait staff, like hotel staff. So there's been a pretty significant jump there. The thing is to remember is that while there are a lot of people, if you will, in that sector, the wages are still not comparable to, IT or lawyers, or doctors. So the total volume of dollars, if you will, is not huge going into the economy. And so if you're raising somebody's wage from $18 to $25 an hour, it's still $25 an hour. It's not $600 an hour, or whatever the opposite is. So there's right. Some of that impact as well. We've seen some wage increases in private sector union contracts, certainly in construction, but there's big demand. And again, that's a sector where folks are getting older, and even probably some of them remember buying chocolate bars for 5 and 10 cents. But a lot of them are starting to, get older. They're having trouble replacing those folks. Wages are consequently going up because governments are still trying to build stuff. So that's where you're seeing wage growth. There's a lot of tightness in the economy. The unemployment numbers came out today. They're 5.1%. It's almost the lowest on record. In Ontario jobs went up 15,000 from last month's 100,000. So the people working, the employment is still going up. So the labor market's still very tight. There's a big mismatch between, employers are having trouble. There's a lot of vacancies out there. They're having trouble finding folks. I mean, I can vouch for that. We've been trying to hire, and it's been challenging. So, we have folks, we interview them, and they come into the interview, they've already got 2 other job offers. So, it's a tight labor market, and that to some degree is driving inflation. Where it's low, I think, or where it's been restrained is on the public sector side. And I'm sure you're probably going to want to get into that. So I'll just leave it at that for now.
November 2021 in British Columbia, a time and a place that introduced most of us to a new term, atmospheric river. If you're like me and your imagination isn't limber enough to visualize an atmospheric river, here's some help. According to the Glossary of Meteorology, a long, narrow band of concentrated water vapor in the sky, the largest rivers of fresh water on the planet, transporting on average more than double the flow of the Amazon River. Now, because you've been listening here the last little while, you know our presenting sponsor, TELUS, is deeply committed to the idea of resilience and reliability. Often, that manifests in billion-dollar investments in technology. Other times, it's how they go above and beyond to keep people connected in the direst circumstances. The force of 2 Amazon rivers suddenly plunging down upon you and your loved ones, I'd say that qualifies as direst. Historic flooding, just shy of biblical flooding, washing out roads, highways, bridges, and towns, and leading to evacuation orders across several communities, including the Inklapaumak Nation and City of Merritt. Thousands forced them from their homes and into emergency centers in Kelowna, Kamloops, and Hope. TELUS was among the first to put a call into the First Nations Health Authority. What do you need? Was the single question they asked. The answer was multi-layered, starting with TELUS quickly donating 120 devices to children so that they could get connected and keep learning while away from their communities. And then some critical financial help. $10,000 to fund emergency care packages of food and essentials in collaboration with the Health Authority. The TELUS Friendly Future Foundation made further donations of $60,000 to the Merritt Friendship Center, $50,000 to support 8 surrounding First Nations needing help, and another $10,000 to assist with a housing program in Merritt. Service bills were also put on pause for the communities affected. As powerful as atmospheric rivers are, Herle Burlyites, what they can't wash away is the human instinct to care for and help others, or a generous and resilient spirit. More next week. Just to stick with this for a second, because you're an economist, and am I misremembering Economics 100 at the University of Regina, where I thought I learned that full employment was a goal of the economy, not a problem in the economy?
There's different definitions of full economy.
I think they used to use 4% back then.
That's right. 4% was the natural unemployment, the rate of unemployment, or whatever, the narrow. So that's, that was a long time ago, David. Not quite as long ago as the 10-cent chocolate bars, but not far off of that. So I think there's still some reliance on what they call the Phillips curve. So is inflation and unemployment, are they sort of inversely related? As you have higher inflation, you're going to get, et cetera. So it's a bit in flux right now. And there's nothing wrong with having low unemployment. Where the problem is when you have lots of job vacancies. And, I think we're into a period. I mean, Armin Nalnesian, a well-known economist, especially in this area. I think she nailed
friend of the pod.
Exactly, friend of the pod. She nailed it. She said, for the past 30, 40 years, we've had a situation of effectively oversupply of labor, and now it's kind of flipped, right? A lot of folks, especially in developed economies, are getting older. Those populations they're aging. People are leaving the labor market. That's what we're seeing too in Canada to some degree. A lot of baby boomers are retiring because they're getting to that age. And they aren't being replaced as quickly by the folks that are coming in behind. You also have, I think, hangover from the pandemic and a lot of aid money. There was a lot of support given by the federal and provincial governments. There's still some of that money sitting in bank accounts, so people are still spending even if they're not working, as much as they would like or whatever the case may be. So
but isn't it kind of fucked? Isn't it kind of fucked to have an economic theory that says that unemployment's better than full employment?
You always need some unemployment. because you need to have people moving in and out of jobs, right? And if I'm an employer, I would like to have a little bit of unemployment. It makes my negotiating position marginally stronger. If we're all fighting over people, then it becomes very, very tricky. So no, I think just like when you're staffing an office, right? You're always going to have people leaving, people coming. It's a normal course of events. There always will be some unemployment in the system. You can't have absolutely everybody who wants to work in a job that they want at a particular point in time. That's just not the way the labor market works.
Right. But by the way, that wouldn't be true now either. By the way, if you're giving that test, people being in a job that they want.
That's right. That's always been and then of course you have, what is a job that you want and what is a job that you like? And we'll go on a tangent just for a second. And I'm really lucky. I'm in a job that I love. It hasn't always been that way. I know, and I have a somewhat checkered career history that kind of shows that, but I'm in a job that I love, and a lot of people aren't. And a lot of times, I kind of advise the kids. I said, if you can do something that you really like doing, 60 or 70% of the time, I think you're doing pretty well. 80%, you've hit you're never going to like it 100% of the time, except me. That's different. But I'm lucky. But it's normal.
Yeah, you've never explained that 3-year gap in your resume.
Yeah, and we're gonna keep it that way. No, I was the guy in the corner selling chocolate bars.
Let's get to the government here. Your long-range forecast shows the government running a series of small surpluses out to 27, 28, something like that. People used to say that Ontario had the largest debt of any non-national government in the world and seemed to be very concerned about that. Is that still true, and is that still a concern?
It's still true. It's never been a concern. So we've done these cool, I should have shot you this video. We've done these really cool, what we call Peter's 2 cents videos. It's me kind of talking into a camera, walking around the legislature. And I do one on this specifically. Ontario has had the largest subnational debt for a little while. Of course, you have to define what does subnational mean, right? So, how do you compare yourself? So that's one, but we'll forget about that. More importantly is, it's not the size of the debt that matters. It's your ability to manage it, right? And how do you manage it? You pay interest on that debt. So there's 2 things you got to think about when you're managing debt. One is, can I afford the interest payments? And 2 is, when I need to refinance my debt, will people lend me money? That's probably actually number 1. If anybody who's in a treasury department, their only concern is, can I sell debt to the market? Will the market buy my debt? Because if they don't, I'm basically in big, big trouble. So Ontario has had no issue refinancing its debt for many years. The interest payments on the debt are somewhere, at this point, quite a bit under 10% of total revenues. And I think even somebody like Don Drummond will agree that, that's not a bad marker. If you can keep it around 6 or 7, that's pretty low. It's about the lowest it's been. So we can manage the debt. And then people often say, well, shouldn't the government always balance, and shouldn't the government not carry debt? And I would say, well, governments aren't households. They're very different. Governments are around for today's taxpayers and for tomorrow's taxpayers. Households, not to the same degree. So we saw what happened in Alberta when they tried to they got rid of their debt. And I think you had this on your Chiefs podcast, right? When they got rid of the debt. In the meantime, there were a whole bunch of schools that needed to be built that didn't get built. There's a whole bunch of consequences to that, to the delivery of public services. So there always will be debt in the system. And, in public practice, public policy theory, when you're borrowing money today to do something, the idea is to have that benefit available today to today's taxpayers and the future taxpayers, like a hospital or a school or a courthouse. And those last 30 or 40 years, and everybody benefits over that period, so everybody should pay a little bit towards that.
A once prominent economist named Lester Thurow used to say that the job of government was to represent the future to the present.
So my response to that is, the job of a politician or a government is to be able to buy enough political capital to provide enough space to the government writ large to think about the longer term, right? So basically stay in power long enough by doing a lot of short-term stuff. I'll take an example. Build the bike path so that you can build the port, right? So you have to stay in the public mind that you're doing what they want you to do. And in the meantime, you also have an obligation, especially in a democratic country and one that concerns itself with governance, to do things that are useful and good and helpful for the long term.
So if you were an opposition party that wanted to spend more than the Ford government wants to spend, you would look at your data and you would say, how much room do I have on the deficit front before I encounter those problems that Peter was just talking about people either not wanting to lend me money or the interest cost rising too high? What's a carryable deficit for Ontario right now?
I'm going to try to do the math in my head right now, but I think, and again, everybody's got a different comfort zone. We've been as high as 15 cents on the dollar in interest payments back in the early 90s, and that was seen as untenable.
Yeah, but that was considered to be a catastrophe.
That's right. That's right. So, I think a lot of people, and again, it's not really up to me, it's up to the market ultimately. So if I'm saying 10% is reasonable, but I have an economy that is, let's say, a resource-based economy that's up and down like a yo-yo, and we have provinces like that, 10% might be too high because it might be super cheap in an era where high oil prices, and it may be way too high in an era of low oil prices. Ontario has got a very diversified economy, the most diversified in the country. So we can certainly handle more interest on payment, more debt than, or certainly higher, more deficits than we probably could. But that's the art of governing, right? It's not really.
But can we handle more than what is currently projected? If these deficits were double, if instead of a $5 billion surplus, we ran a $5 billion deficit, problem?
No, it's not a problem right now. It's not a problem in the short term. If it's something that we're doing on a regular basis going forward, and those deficits start to get bigger and bigger, and if the economy stops growing for whatever reason, then it becomes a problem. So it's not something you can just sort of set in stone. I'd say right now, if you wanted to do that, there's not a big difference when you're looking at a $200 billion spend. 5 billion high, 5 billion low. It's not statistically significant. It's not going to have a big impact. It's the cumulative impact. So if you start running more and more of these deficits, and if interest rates keep going up, then cumulatively your interest costs start going up. And the idea is to make sure you don't get caught in that trap and then find yourself waking up one day with a big recession, revenue drops through the floor, interest rates go up through the roof, and all of a sudden you're having trouble selling your bonds at a reasonable price. So that's, it'd be nice to say, yeah, here's A and here's B, but it's not quite that easy. If it was, of course, it'd be different, but it's not that easy.
Right. Gotcha. Okay. So I was super interested to see a chart in your report that showed that program spending in Ontario is $35 billion higher now than it was in the Ford government's first full term in office. Did I read that correctly?
We do lots of charts. I'm trying to remember which one you're looking at.
I think it was about $185 billion now, and it had been about $150 billion in 2018, 2019.
I think you might have been looking at, again, I'm just going by what I remember. So 150 seems low. I think 180, it's always been around 175, 180. We certainly saw a lot more spending during the pandemic. That's gone up a lot, and then we're just coming off of that. So, but the government is spending more money than it did. There's no question about it. But you know what? When you're so two things, right? So we had the pandemic. There was a lot of money going out the door during the pandemic, an inordinate amount of money, but we had an inordinate problem, right? It was really a crazy, I don't want to get into all the adjectives.
I consider that to be an exception to everything.
Absolutely,
right?
It is. It's an exception to everything. But when you're running a government where 60 odd percent of your budget is healthcare, or 50, whatever it is, 75 billion on 200. So no, it's about 40%. And then 30 billion on education. So between those two, you're approaching, over 50% of your total budget. And you're in a province where the population is growing, hence putting pressure on education, hence putting pressure on healthcare. And you're in a population that's also aging rapidly, hence putting more pressure on healthcare. You're always, if your intent is to maintain the existing service level, you will always spend more money year over year by those forces. If you're going to meet the demand that is presented by the demographic issues we have, you're always going to have to spend historic amounts every year.
Okay. You've probably read about the tragic train derailment in Ohio. Maybe you've seen coverage of the derailed tanker cars, the fire, and the devastated residents of East Palestine. And maybe it all has you thinking about rail safety in your own city or town. You're not alone if that's the case. In fact, our sponsor, CN, thinks about rail safety constantly, and it wants to say a few words here about the steps it takes to prevent incidents, big and small, from happening on CN tracks. First of all, safety is the prime directive at CN. It's at the core of everything the railway does. Every single company meeting begins with a discussion of safety, and CN puts serious money into the issue. In the last 8 years, the company has invested about $24 billion into their network across North America. Inspections are carried out ceaselessly by fully automated rolling systems. Sensors on tracks inspect train wheels, and sensors on the train inspect tracks. In severe cold, the system doubles down. Special cars deployed along the length of the train boost pressure in the air brake system. Staff receive intensive training and have in turn trained over 100,000 first responders, any of whom have access to information on CN cargoes. Do CN trains carry hazardous materials? Yes, they do. Chemicals like the ones used to purify our water, or in our food, or in our household items we use every day. All of this must move, and trains keep countless trucks off streets and highways. Only about 10% of CN cargoes are classified as hazardous, and 99.9% of all cargoes arrive safely. In short, CN is fanatical about safety. You can count on that. It's the only responsible way to run a railroad. Okay, but I'm just trying to understand because, there's the difference between rhetoric and action, and I'm trying to sort through fundamentally, and I don't, this is a political characterization, so answer it however you're comfortable.
Sure.
But is the Ford government an austerity government or a spending government?
That's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure I have an easy answer for that. So again, I think it depends on what people consider to be austerity or not. So our recent reports have shown that. So let's back up. So there's a couple of things that I'm watching as an FAO, as a budget officer. I'm watching the transparency on spending. That's really where on budgeting writ large, spending specifically. And what I'm seeing two things. I'm seeing since the pandemic, we've had a significant increase in budgeted contingency funds and non-allocated funds. So we have the government sending a lot of money aside, a lot more than historically, ostensibly to deal with emergencies as they come up. We also see a lot of underspending against plans. So typically, governments, as you know, cannot spend more than what they've been allowed to spend. The legislative authority, the legislature provides legal authority for the government to raise and spend public funds. They cannot spend more than they have legal authority to spend. So they're always going to spend a little less. Typically, they spend about 2.7% less than what they're allowed to spend. What we've seen in the last 3 years with this government is we've seen that number creep up year after year. And now, as of the third quarter, in our third quarter our expenditure monitor, we see an underspend of around 5%. So I'm curious to see what the end of the year looks like, but we're seeing a bit of a creep, and why I think that's a bit of it. So again, back to your question: is it austerity or is it spending? They are spending more and more money every year for the reasons I mentioned. Yet They're
It
still
sounds
running.
like austerity by stealth.
Well, that's always some.
Because
Yeah,
my experience is this, Peter. My experience is with the Martin budgets in the 1990s.
absolutely. Yeah.
And they were layered with prudent assumptions throughout and padded figures throughout, and then a contingency fund on top of that. And the purpose of all that was to guarantee that we undershot our spending and therefore ensured that we balanced the budget. So it was, in that instance, austerity by stealth. Is that what's going on here?
So it's hard to tell exactly, because the last couple of years we've seen some big surprises on the upside, if you will, in revenue. So the government ran a surplus last year, and nobody was, we were projecting something close, but not anywhere close to what they ran. And largely because the corporate income tax revenue came in way above everybody's forecast. So that wasn't a stealth thing. That was like, oh my God, how did this happen? And it actually, I think, might have caused them a bit of I'm speculating, but they knew they were walking into a period of labor negotiations. And I don't know that they were really keen to be showing big surpluses while they're about to renegotiate wages, but that's beyond my pay grade, David. So that's more your angle. But so it's too early to tell right now if we're seeing austerity by stealth, but I know I've sent signals out. I am watching to see if that's the case. The reason I have a problem with that is that when you're asking MPPs to approve a spending plan and you have no intention of whatever, I can't judge motive, but if you don't spend the money the way that you were allowed to spend it or approved to spend it, and you do that on a regular basis, then you're not being transparent with the folks that are giving you the authority to spend that money. So there's certainly some leeway. We've come off, the pandemic. There's lots of reasons why things are still in flux a little bit, but it is something that I'm keeping an eye on.
Right. You mentioned Don Drummond, and one of the things that Don used to really reinforce to me over the years was that if you want to reduce spending, you have to do it in a sustainable way. If you put an artificial, arbitrary cap on something, it's ultimately the pressure is going to burst in that area ultimately, and you're going to end up with more cost than you had in the start. So it's important to look at whether what you're doing is sustainable over time, or whether you're just creating a medium or long-term problem for yourselves. Do you see any area of spending in here that is artificially capped or unsustainably capped?
So I think this is where the nuance gets really interesting. So our last EBO, our economic and budget outlook, and even our Q3 expenditure monitor, we show that the government has, for this fiscal year anyway, has let's take healthcare as an example. It's a nice one. They've allocated, in fact, more money to healthcare than we think they need for this fiscal year. Which either means that they'll move some of that money out, or they will announce some other programs, et cetera, between now and the end of March, I suppose. I suspect some of that money is probably public health money that they didn't really need to spend because the pandemic wasn't as bad as they expected. But going forward, we see a shortfall, and we talk about the $21 billion shortfall. So if I go back a bit, we go back to previous governments before this one, we always had pressure in
Be gentle now. Be gentle.
No, this is a problem that's been around for decades, right? From the time I was selling chocolate bars, baby boomers were in school and buying chocolate bars. Sorry, I forgot I wasn't supposed to talk about that 3-year career gap where I was selling chocolate bars.
Yeah.
When I was buying chocolate bars, 10 cents. The government was building schools to accommodate the surge in the baby boom population who were going to school at that time. Well, we knew 40, 50 years out, they were going to be lining up at the hospitals and lining up for medical care. So this isn't a new problem. Every government's had to deal with this back to then. So we saw in the previous government, there was a focus on home care, right? The idea was, let's do more on home care to relieve pressure on hospitals and long-term care. Makes sense. We see in our health report that we released a couple of days ago, we have significant capacity in home care. And home care capacity has grown faster than the population that uses it. That's a nice position to be in. However, hospital capacity has shrunk relative to population, and long-term care bed capacity has shrunk relative to population. So, as a government, you can't do everything all the time. So you focus on some areas. And now we're seeing, so we saw a significant austerity in hospital care, hospital spend, in the last few, decade and a half. And now we're in a position where we have to spend a bunch of money on hospitals. To your point, if you starve something without changing how you deliver. So if you decided, okay, people, you're only going to go to a hospital for something really acute and really complex, and otherwise we're going to find a different way to treat you. And maybe it's cheaper and maybe it's faster and we're going to spend money there. Then maybe you can relieve the pressure on the hospitals and you can reduce their budgets without having a service delivery impact. But that's not what happened. So yeah, it always happens. If you starve something without changing back to MBA 101, right? If you don't change the business process to deliver the service faster, cheaper, better, and you yet starve that budget, you're going to have to pay the piper down the road. It's perfectly, normal.
Sounds like a job for McKinsey. Your lights, your fancy whirring toothbrush, your coffee maker, home alarm, computer, the internet, bread maker, bubbles in your water maker. That thing intermittently going beep in your house you're still trying to locate. The EV you drive now, or the EV you will be driving in the future. Because you're all smart people, I know you've caught on to the common piece here. All these things need electricity to operate. Now multiply your electricity needs by the needs of 99.9% of everybody else. This is the reason why we need an always-on source of electricity. One that's dependable and clean, producing zero climate change GHG emissions. I'm talking about nuclear power. I want to underline this. Nuclear power is the clean energy technology we need to get to net zero. It's already producing more than half of Ontario's electricity, helping us decarbonize at precisely this moment, as you hear these words through your electronic device. How? It provides the dependable, consistent baseload of clean electricity that works hand in hand with and enables the contributions of wind and solar. What that means is it's the essential part of getting us to net zero and our clean energy future. Remember, the wind's got to blow to move those turbines, and the sun doesn't shine all the time. Natural gas? The single biggest misconception out there is that natural means clean. It doesn't. It's methane, a greenhouse gas. The point is this. Nuclear energy is a solution to climate change that's already here. In Canada, our own CANDU reactors have been producing it safely for 70 years. Our newest sponsor is the Nuclear Innovation Institute. They know that energy dependability and clean energy are a public good, and that for our coffee makers, computers, and one day all of our electric cars to work, Canada needs more nuclear power. Stay tuned. In the coming weeks, we'll be talking more about this and how it benefits all Canadians. Or go to nii.ca/nuclear now to learn more. All right. When I asked you the question about unsustainable caps, one of the things I was thinking about was public sector wages. So it is my understanding, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, that despite the belief that Kathleen Wynne was a free spender, that public sector wages have been under serious constraint for a long time in Ontario. And that is that a sustainable situation? And if not, what are the implications of increasing the pay, or what are the implications of not increasing compensation in the public sector?
That's, it's a very pertinent question. Now they're in the era of labor shortage rather than labor surplus. Right. And yes, public sector wages in Ontario have been under a lot of they've been held back for a long time. Below the rate of inflation and below the rate of market compensation, if you will. And we've done a lot of work in this area. We did a public sector compensation note several months ago that looked exactly at that. So, and we also looked at, okay, so what does that mean going forward for the wage bill? When you're in an era of, 4.5% or 6% inflation, depending when you measure it, 5%. And wages historically have gone up around between 1.9 and 2.7%. So what's going to happen when you have to renegotiate contracts with your unions? And here we are, right? Here we are. So the first thing that happens, and we see that in our health report quite explicitly, is when people think they can make more money doing something else, they will. So consequently, we have a significant shortage of nurses and personal support workers, PSWs, in the healthcare system. At the same time, the government wants to add a lot more hospital beds and long-term care beds, which are going to need...
Because you can make as much money working at the 7-Eleven as you can as a personal support worker without the fucking grief, right?
I don't know, but yeah, you're not making huge dollars as a personal support worker. It can be a very rewarding experience and work, but it's also a lot of grief. It's having kind of indirectly employed some in the very recently.
We all know.
It's very So anyway, it's any labor market, right? If you can make, we saw that in the pandemic. A lot of people left the restaurant trade because, like, you know what, I had enough of these hours. I had enough of this stuff. I'm going to go and do something from my home where I'm, in front of a TV, in front of a computer, and I'm making as much or more money without the aggravation. So there's certainly, that's supply and demand, right? That's how our economy works. So there's certainly that. So there will be pressure. There will be pressure. We also have this thing called Bill 124, where the government introduced it to cap wages at 1%.
Sure. Can I stop you for a second and get you to explain this? So it's not pressure from, not just at least, pressure from a union that's going to be fighting hard for its workers. It's pressure, you're saying, from the reality that if we don't increase pay, we won't attract these people that we need to do these jobs. So it's not a union pressure thing. It's a labor market pressure thing.
It's a labor market pressure. It is that. Labor market is composed of unions. Wages are one factor. Working conditions are a factor. Working hours are a factor. You're going to have people running around on their own time as PSWs between work and not getting paid for it. That's a working condition issue.
Yes.
Not being able to control your hours as a nurse if you're required to do X, Y, Z overtime, that's a working conditions issue. So there are many ways to address the problem, in addition to wages, because I'm not going to stand here and say wages are too low or wages are too high. I don't know. But I know one thing. I know that we have record high vacancies in the sector. I know that we are going to need more and more of these folks if we continue delivering the program the way we've always delivered it. And something's going to have to give to be able to provide the supply of labor to meet the demand that's required.
Cool. All right. Well, that's a good segue into your healthcare report. And, I sort of torqued this in my intro because it was a big headline in the news. Yeah. But let's untorque it, detorque it a bit. So the report on healthcare that your office released said that the Ford government had budgeted $21 billion less for healthcare than it needs to implement the health policies it has so far committed to. Can you elaborate on that?
Sure. The easy answer is it's math. We cost out commitments and the current policy. We looked at over 5 or 6 years to 2027, 28. And we look at what the government spending plan has allocated to that, and we do the subtraction. So, and then we cumulate, year over year, we do the math, and then the cumulative total. So that's over the period. That's not every year. That's the total is $21 billion. And I want to make it clear that is.
So $4 to $5 billion a year?
Yeah.
$4 to $5 billion a year?
$4 to $5 billion a year, ballpark. As I said, this fiscal year, they've actually allocated $1.2 billion more than we think they need. So a couple of things quickly. So what we do to cost the program is we have a fair bit of data now to understand, how many hospital beds are being used every year and what it costs per day to run a full hospital bed. You run that out over the year, you multiply it by 365 days times how many hospitals, et cetera, et cetera. And then what you do to forecast is you look at inflation. So what is inflation? How inflation is going to affect some of the costs of maintaining those hospital beds. And you look at demand. So aging demographics means you're going to have more and more beds being used every year, and you lump that together, and that's what you use as your growth forecast. So you know how many more beds you're going to need 6 years out than you'd have today. And the government wants to add 7,000 new beds, if you will, and there are a couple of different ways, and those require, staff, and those require those sorts of things, and it requires money to pay for the beds, it requires money to pay for the operation of those beds, and it requires money to pay for the staff. So when you add all that up, and then you compare to what the government said it's prepared to spend at the moment, then there's the gap. Now, that doesn't mean that's going to be a gap forever. That doesn't mean they have to go and try to grow money trees. There is money in the system. There's money, as I said before, in contingency funds. There's a new healthcare accord with the federal government we figure is going to bring $10.9 billion new dollars in over the next 5 years. So some of that money may be used to offset some of that cost. But what it comes down to is it's like, and we're not advocating that they need to spend money to fix healthcare. That's not what we're saying. We're just saying, here's what you as a government has already said you're going to do, but you haven't shown us, the people, that you at the moment have a plan to pay for it. So that's all this is. It's like, me.
So as a consumer, what am I supposed to take from this? What am I supposed to take from this, Peter? Because what you're really saying is it's not that the money isn't in the fiscal framework. It's just not allocated to the areas of spending that would achieve their objectives at the moment. It's in contingency reserves or things called other programs or other spending. So as a consumer of news, am I supposed to take from this that they are deliberately not going to achieve their healthcare objectives? Or am I supposed to take from this that they are non-transparent, opaque budgeters?
Well, I think you could take either one, right? Depending on on what side of the fence you sit on. And I sit right squarely in the middle. So just so we know that, right on top of the fence. But I think you could take either one. And my push has always been be transparent, and part of our reports show that, hey, we know there's this money that hasn't yet been allocated, and we know there's a cost pressure that hasn't yet been fulfilled. And then that's kind of where our job stops, right? And we hand that up to MPPs and we say, now it's your turn to ask the why. What are those questions? That's what holding a government to account means. Why are you committing X but only funding it to Y? Like to Y is making out the right. Whatever. But so why is there a gap? Yeah. And how are you going to address the gap? Does that mean you're going to have to raise taxes? Does that mean you're going to have to cut services from other areas? How, government, are you going to do this? And luckily, it's not me that has to ask those questions. I'm the one that gets to posit the analysis so those questions can get asked.
Okay. So more of an observation than a criticism is what you're saying.
I think it's an observation, and I'll let others decide if it's a good thing or a bad thing.
Gotcha. It's not often that you find labor and industry coming together, but that's the case for our sponsor Uber and their collaboration with the United Food and Commercial Workers of Canada. Why would the leading rideshare and delivery platform in Canada and the country's largest private sector union work together, you may ask? The answer may surprise you, folks. The fact of the matter is that in 2023, there are no legislative frameworks in place that offer benefits and protections to gig workers like drivers and delivery people. Tired of the status quo, Uber and UFCW Canada sought a way to create a better future for app-based workers across the country. The landmark agreement they signed on January 27, 2022 outlines their commitment to over 100,000 drivers and delivery people on Uber. 89% of them support this agreement. What does this look like in action? When Wasim from Toronto got locked out of his Uber driver account after trying to add his new car, he didn't have to tackle this issue on his own. Wasim was able to contact UFCW, explained his situation, and a casework team member helped him get back on the Uber platform. Before the agreement, Wasim's story and hundreds like it would not have been possible. With the agreement in place, over 750 drivers and delivery people had access to representation when they needed it most. Learn more about the impact of this historic agreement for hundreds of people like Wasim at uber.com/UFCW Canada. So there was at one point a lot of talk about whether or not the Ontario government had spent on healthcare all the money that the federal government had transferred to it for healthcare during COVID. You were at the center of that debate for a period of time.
No thanks to you.
Now that all the dust is settled and the smoke is cleared, what's the truth?
Effectively, the truth is, from what I remember, is that pretty much all the money got spent. I think it was, a lot of it was a timing issue.
Well, that's disappointing. I was hoping for a big fucking scandal here. You don't have a big scandal from it.
The deficit wasn't as high. A lot of the money got spent. The reason the deficit came in way below expectations because the revenue side, again, was way, way higher than anybody. I guess we all collectively forgot that when you write big checks to people so they can stay home and not get sick and get other people sick, they have money to spend. So they're going to spend it one way or another. If they can't go out to a restaurant, they're going to go buy something online or buy a car or whatever the case is. That generates revenue for the government. And we kind of forgot about, I think we all collectively forgot about that, and that's what happened.
Okay. So your office says that healthcare spending should be growing by about 3.6% on an annual basis. That seems low to me based on history. Are there restraint assumptions built into that? Because healthcare spending normally runs well above the rate of inflation.
Yes, it does. Healthcare spending normally does. And I think, as we say in the report, the big risks to our forecast, I think, is salaries. So we're assuming that growth rate of salary follows historical norms. And I think that's probably, we're probably going to be wrong on that. But we can't presume what a wage settlement will be in the sector. I mean, we have to start somewhere. We have to have a baseline that we can defend. And that's the baseline that we're choosing, and that's how we're choosing to defend it. And I'm sure folks will look at me and say, but that's not realistic. And I'll say to them, it probably isn't, but this is where our starting point is. And once we see what the wage settlement situation looks like, we'll update it. That's all. But we aren't negotiating, and we don't want to presume. So yeah, that's one risk. And I think so that's a big one. So that's the wage settlements that are coming. Of course, then there's the Bill 124 piece, which we can get into when you're ready. But that could be, if that gets overturned, that will.
Well, do it now. Tell me how that fits in.
So Bill 124, just to remind everybody, was a legislation that was brought in by this government back, I think it was 2019, and it was effectively a 1% wage cap for all unionized government employees, if you will. So anybody who was being paid for it by the province. So it was nurses, it was colleges, it was public servants, everybody. So for 3 years, once their existing contracts matured, the next 3 years, they would be held to a 1% annual wage growth. And then after that 3 years was over, they'd go back to collective bargaining, et cetera. So we did some work in that. We've estimated it's probably saved the province about $10 billion, give or take. The unions took the government to court. The court basically ruled that bill violated the constitutional right to assembly, and therefore was null and void. The government has appealed that decision. So until that decision gets finalized, we haven't chosen to include that in our forecast because right now the law of the land is Bill 124. But if that gets
at least one member of the Supreme Court is currently otherwise occupied.
Well, these things take time, right? There's all kinds of little things that can get in the middle of between your case and when the Supreme Court's ready to hear it. So, can't control that stuff, right? These are tail events. Right. But anyway, it's, if that gets overturned, then we figure the government's going to have to ante up another $8.5 billion to compensate folks who are put under that wage cap. And our calculation is the difference between the 1% and what the historical wage settlement would have been. So those are significant risks to our forecast. So that 21 billion might go up, likely will. And so I think those are two big ones. The other thing too is that, and I'll get into this even though you haven't asked me, is that you still are going to have pressure, even if the government's able to build the 30,000 long-term care beds, even if everything is tickety-boo and everything gets built according to schedule, they're still not going to have enough to meet the demand 6 years out.
No, this is what you this is what you said. This is what you said in the report, which is that they want to build 7,000 beds, right? And that you don't think they'll be able to build them with the money they've allocated. And even if they did build them, we'd be further behind than when we started.
Yeah, we'd be a little further behind. We think we need 7,500 beds just to stay even to where we were in 2019. Right. So pandemic, we try to take that out of the picture because it was an anomaly. And how we come up with that. So this is what we call, this is the work we do, right? We look at the plan. What is the spending? And then what are the risks to the plan? So I've already told you what the risks are to our forecast, mainly on the wage side. But what is the risk to the government of not achieving what they're trying to achieve, which is let's get hospital capacity back to where it was in 2019. Let's get the wait list down in long-term care beds. Let's get rid of hallway healthcare as best we can. So these are kind of big policy objectives. So we look at the hospital bed piece for starters. And they're trying to add 7,000 beds. And 2,500 of those beds, they're hoping to be able to free up by moving people from hospital to alternative levels of care, so i.e. long-term care beds and something outside the hospital. So far, I think they've gotten about 400 of those beds freed up right now. We don't think they're going to get there. We don't think they're going to free up 2,500 beds because there's nowhere to put those people. The long-term care bed situation is pretty tight, right? And not necessarily because there are no beds, but there's also no staff for those beds or a lack of. So we think they're going to have trouble hitting that target. On the 4,000 new hospital beds they want to build, we think they're going to have trouble maybe not building the beds, but staffing the beds. So because they haven't set aside enough money, that's where the 21 billion comes in. Part of that was to spend for staff for hospital beds, but they haven't allocated the money. So they might have a bed sitting empty. That doesn't really help anybody. So that's a risk on their side too. So there's lots of things that can go wrong.
This reminds me of when I got briefed on the Wynne government's plan to spend about $70 or $80 billion on public transit and other transit issues in the GTA. And I said to the briefers, I said, when all this is done, what will commute times be like? And they said, with any luck, about the same.
And that's valid, right? That's valid because the other side of the argument is, well, if we don't do this, then what? And that's where I always find myself in that position. I'm kind of like the guy that says, well, what if we didn't do it? Well, it'd be a lot worse than it is right now. What's kind of fun is that when you look at something like long-term care beds, so when you're 75 years old, most folks, not most who are 75, but most of the folks in long-term care beds are 75 or over. Right? That's kind of where you start to see the population of nursing homes at that age start to go up. So that's why we model, okay, how many 75-year-olds are there today? How many were there 10 years ago? How many will there be in 10 years from now? And you do the ratio, and that's how you come up with roughly how many beds you'll need. Hospital is the same thing. So hospital, if you're 65 or over, you are using...
You have to do the other end of it, presumably too, Peter. You have to do the other end of it. Like how long does a 75-year-old person now live?
That's right. That's right.
Right.
So you look at life expectancies. So those are tables that are out there too, and they're living a lot longer than they used to. So on the average. So yeah, you're right. And then if you look at things like hospitals. So if you're 65 or over, so more than 50% of the hospital beds are occupied by folks who are 65 and over. So if you look at that population going forward, that's how you figure out how many hospital beds you need. So it's and ultimately, we've talked about all around this, but it's an integrated system, right? It's all interconnected. So if you haven't got staff to staff and you haven't got long-term care beds, you're going to have backups in hospitals. If you have backups in hospitals, you might have people waiting longer in ER before they can get admitted because you haven't got a bed for them. They're waiting longer in ER because you haven't got staff, nurses to look after them. You have surgical wait times that have gone through the roof. I mean, there's apparently starting to
21 hours the average time spent in ER now.
Yeah,
you said 21 hours.
21 hours. Yeah, way higher than it's ever been. And a lot of that is staffing because we also say in the report the volumes of folks going into ER is actually lower than it was in 2019, yet they're waiting longer. So that's a staffing issue, largely. And
so if I break my leg and I go to emerge, I'm going to wait there for 21 hours?
If you break your leg, it's hard. I mean, they'll triage you, right? If you break your leg and you're at risk of blood poisoning, you probably won't be waiting 21 hours. If you broke your leg and without, that's a triage thing.
Yeah.
But if you need to be admitted, I mean,
assuming it's not critical, I'm going to be there for 21 hours. Yeah.
Well, if it's critical enough for you to be admitted, on average, you'll be there for 21 hours. And there might be a chance that they stick you on a gurney and put you in the hallway. Right? Because the number of hallway patients, they actually count this though. They actually have a measure that says how many people are being treated in a non-conventional space. And that number dropped during the pandemic, and it's in our report as well. And now it's gone right back up to past where it was in 2019. And that's the bed issue, right? That's where you have hospital beds being taken up by folks who should be in a different level of care. And therefore, the people who need a hospital bed are sitting in a stretcher in a hallway waiting for that bed to free up.
Right. All right. Your report also suggests that the system will, if everything the government intends goes according to plan, be short 33,000 nurses and personal support workers in 5 years. That seems like a lot of people to be short. How could one possibly address that problem?
So we get to that number, we look at the current vacancy rates, we look at recruitment and retention rates, we look at retirement rates, and we try to take into account as much as we can whatever new policies have been announced in terms and their impacts in terms of, are they making it easier for folks to come into the profession? Are they recruiting more aggressively from other countries? Maybe we'll see something on wages at some point. We certainly saw something on wages for PSWs back during the pandemic. They increased the hourly rate. That will have an impact, and that will bring more people into the profession. But it's a problem, right? It's a problem, and the government is trying different ways to get at that problem. Luckily, I don't have to provide policy prescriptions. Like I said, I've got a fun job. I get to put the problem out there.
Right.
I get to quantify it, but I don't have to say how to go about fixing the problem. So, and I'm quite comfortable staying in that space right now.
It just seems massive to me. 33,000 people to get into a profession.
It's a lot, but I mean, it's again, there's a nice bar chart in the report that shows that 33,000 relative to the total population. And it's significant, but it's not like half, right? It's maybe 10 or 12%.
And you factored in their programs. Like, I understand that they're literally paying people to study nursing now, or like they'll pay for the whole shot if you study nursing.
That's right.
Right.
That's
and
right.
Even with that, we're not going to catch up.
We're not going to catch up in 5 years. We are starting to see, though, an increase in the catch-up, right? We're going to be better in 5 years than we are now. Now we're in worse shape, but we will see. So those programs will have an effect, but they aren't enough in and of themselves that we can tell right now. I mean, that could change, but right now, in our snapshot in time, we can tell that our forecast is it won't be quite enough.
I've been critical of the Ford government's interest in private delivery of healthcare, so I should ask you about this. Your report indicated that they are increasing spending on the public hospital system. Can you tell me a little bit about that and what you expect the result of that to be?
Well, again, I think what they're hoping for is we're going to start to see an increase in surgical referrals again, and hospitals will have some cash to start to do those surgeries and hire nurses. But we've talked about the difficulty in filling those spots. They're building more. They're going to try to build more beds. That's what some of that hospital funding is for. So that's really where it's geared to. But I think things like surgical wait lists are that's an important consideration. So we did some work in that in the report as well. And we're showing that, the government is not on track as of our data, which was, the surgical wait times and the surgical wait list data comes and goes on a regular basis. And every once in a while, they kind of, verify it and put it out there as an official number, but it changes. So as of the end of September, which is the last official numbers we were able to obtain from the government, and given the rate of change they wanted in terms of increasing surgeries, they weren't going to be able to hit their target of March of 2023. We figured it'd take them till June of 2024 or July to get that wait list down to what it was in 2019. More importantly, in my opinion, is those long waiters, those who who are waiting longer than clinically recommended. So, I mean, if your broken leg should be fixed in 3 weeks and you have to wait 3 months, you're considered a long waiter. Being facetious a little bit, but that's the example. That list is up to 107,000. It was at 39,000 pre-pandemic, and we don't see that coming down anytime soon. And that's problematic, because then people are at risk of getting worse.
Yeah, that's right. I hear you. Listen, Peter, the hour's flown by, as it always does. And I'm so grateful for you spending the time with us. You're such an unbelievable resource for any of us who want to try to analyze what people in politics are saying and understand what's possible and what's meaningful about what they say. So it's really terrific that you're there. I'm curious about something. Yeah. If opposition parties, or if any party, the governing party, if any political party wanted you to review their platform and assess it, would you do that?
No, I don't have the legal mandate to do that, and I don't have the resources to do that. And we've been asked. The Parliamentary Budget Office in Ottawa does. That was part of when their law was changed, and they were given additional resources and the mandate to do that work. So, do I have an opinion on it? I am of two minds in that one. I think, in theoretical sense, it's nice to have some authoritative numbers out there when people are talking about campaign promises. On a more practical business sense, it's a lot of work and a lot of risk. So, am I looking for that right at this very moment in time? Maybe not necessarily. I got a pretty full plate right now. But if the government or whomever decides that that's something that they would like done and they pass a lot of that effect, absolutely, we'll do it, and we'll do it well.
Awesome. Peter, thank you so much for your time. I'd like to also thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, our sponsors, CN Rail, and Uber Canada, and the Nuclear Innovation Institute. And thank you all for watching and listening, and we'll be back next week with more Herle Burly.
Herle Burly.